They had told her the wolves would tear her apart before the king ever reached the yard. They had said it the way men say a thing they wish to watch happen. Bram with his thumbs in his belt, the kennel boys laughing because he laughed first. She was nothing to them. A scarred girl who slept in the straw with the beasts no one else would feed. An Omega without a wolf of her own, the lowest mouth in a fortress that counted mouths the way it counted coin. "Throw her to them," Bram had said, "and let the king find a clean yard when he comes." So they had locked her in the great enclosure under the black walls and barred the gate and gone to wait for the screaming. The screaming did not come. What came was stranger, and word of it ran the corridors faster than any boy could carry it, until even the king turned his horse toward the kennels to see the thing for himself and put an end to it. He came to dismiss her. He did not. That was the winter of the 9th year of the long frost, in the high keep men called Vorhold, where the river froze so hard the carts crossed it, and the snow did not melt from the battlements until the blood moon of spring. Stay with me, because what the pack knew that night, the whole court would be forced to learn before the thaw. Vorhold sat at the top of the world, a fist of grey stone closed around a courtyard, and it had belonged to the line of the Lycan kings since before there were registries to record it. Ren had come to it at 12, after the fever took her mother and the village she was born in, decided a girl who spoke to dogs and could not shift was bad luck better given away than fed. She had not wept when they handed her over. She had learned by then that weeping spent strength she could not spare. She had walked through the gate of Vorhold with a basket of her mother's herbs and a face that gave nothing, and the houndmaster Otho, old even then, had looked at her hands and her steadiness, and put her to work in the kennels, and there she had stayed for 11 winters. The wolves of Vorhold were not the wolves of the forest. They were the king's own, the great war pack bred from the old blood, beasts that stood near to the shoulder of a horse and whose eyes caught fire in the dark. Men feared them. Men were right to. They had torn the throats from raiders at the eastern wall and took meat from no hand but their keepers. And 3 keepers had died in that yard before Ren came, dragged down for showing fear at the wrong moment. Otho had warned her of all of it the first day. She had listened, and then she had walked into the enclosure with her empty hands open at her sides and stood while the largest of them, a gray male with a torn ear she would come to call Ash, circled her and pushed his nose hard against her sternum and breathed her in. He had not bitten. He had lain down across her feet. Otho, watching from the gate, had said nothing for a long while, and then he had said only, "Well," and never spoke of it again. For 11 years that had been her life. She rose before the bells, broke the ice on the troughs, dressed the wounds the beasts took in the hunts, ground the herbs that brought down their fevers, sat with the dying ones so they would not die alone. The pack knew her step on the stones. They knew her voice pitched low. When she was sick one winter and could not come, Otho told her after, they had refused their meat for 2 days and stood at the gate with their ears flat until she crawled back to them gray-faced, and they ate from her hand, and not before. She had thought little of it. She thought she was simply the one who fed them. She did not let herself think otherwise, because to be chosen by something was to have something to lose, and she had taught herself young not to own that risk. The scar she carried ran from her left wrist to her elbow, a pale rope of old burn. The village had given it to her the night they decided she was cursed, a brand from a poker meant to drive the wrongness out, and it had driven nothing out but the last of her belief that the world meant her well. She kept it covered. She kept most of herself covered. In a place like Vorhold, a woman learned that to be seen was to be measured, and to be measured was to be found wanting, and to be found wanting was to be given away again. So she made herself small and useful and quiet, and the years passed over her like water over a stone, and she believed, with the flat certainty of someone taught it with fire, that no one would ever look at her and want her to stay. Bram changed that, in his way. The steward had run Vorhold's lower yards for 20 years like a man squeezing a fist, and he had hated Wren since the day he understood the wolves would mind her and would not mind him. A keeper the beasts loved was a keeper he could not threaten, and Bram could not abide a thing he could not threaten. He had tried to have her turned out twice. Otho had stopped him both times, quietly, the way the old stop the cruel, by being too useful to cross. Yet Otho was old, and that winter he took a chill in his chest that would not break, and lay in the loft burning and rattling while Wren ground every herb she knew, and watched none of them work, and Bram smelled the gap opening and moved into it. The king was coming. That was the other thing that winter. Kale, the Lycan king of Vorhold, had been 3 years away at the Eastern Wars, holding the passes against the men of the Iron Coast, and he was coming home at last to a fortress that had half forgotten his face. Bram had run the keep in his absence, and Bram did not want it looked at too closely. A king home from war counts his house. He counts the silver and the grain and the men, and he counts the small cruelties that have crept in while his back was turned, and Bram had let a great many small cruelties creep in. So Bram wanted the house clean, and to Bram, a scarred Omega sleeping in the straw was dirt. He decided, with Otho too sick to stop him, that the wolves would do the work the law would not. He would lock her in the enclosure the night before the king arrived and let the beasts solve the problem of her, and in the morning there would be a regrettable accident to report, and a clean yard, and no one left who remembered how he had run it. He told her it was an order. He stood at the gate of the great enclosure in the blue dark with 2 kennel boys behind him, and told her the king had sent word that the pack was to be moved to the inner yard, and someone had to settle them, and who better than the girl they loved? And he smiled when he said, loved. She knew it was a lie before he finished it. She had spent 11 years reading the dishonesties of men with power over her, and Bram lied the way he breathed. She knew, too, that refusing would change nothing but how many hands it took to put her through the gate. So she looked at him, and she looked at the boys who would not meet her eyes, and she said in 2 clauses and no more that the wolves would not need settling and that he should sleep well. Then she walked into the enclosure herself, so that no one would be able to say she had been dragged, and she heard the bar drop behind her. The cold inside was absolute. The enclosure was open to the sky, a wide pit of frozen mud ringed by the black wall, the snow crusted to ice, her breath standing before her like a thing she could touch. The pack rose when she entered. All of them, 24 great bodies coming up out of the dark in a single motion, and for one heartbeat she felt the old village fear move through her, the certainty that she was about to be proven cursed at last. Then Ash crossed the ice to her, his torn ear flat and then lifting, and pressed his great head against her chest the way he had the first day, and the fear went out of her like water from a tipped bowl. She sat down in the frozen mud with her back to the wall. The pack came around her. Not to her front, as a hunting ring closes, but in a wide circle with their flanks turned in and their heads facing out, toward the gate, toward the dark, toward anything that might come. They made a wall of themselves with her at the center of it. She understood then that Bram had been wrong, and she lay down in the warmth of them with Ash's body along her spine, and she did not scream, and she did not freeze, and she waited for morning the way she had waited for every hard thing in her life, with her eyes open and her mouth shut. Morning came with bells. The king had ridden through the lower gate before dawn, ahead of his column, too impatient for ceremony after 3 years, and the first thing he heard inside his own walls was a story told in fear by men who thought it would please him. The cursed kennel girl, my king. The steward had her put to the pack for the safety of the yard, and the beasts have, well, the beasts have not. Come and see. So Kale came and saw, and Wren, lifting her head from the warmth of the pack at the sound of the bar drawn back, saw him for the first time framed in the open gate against the white sky, and her first thought was that the cold had finally killed her, and this was the last shape it sent. He was not what the songs made of kings. He was tall and dark and worn down to the grain, a full beard gone ragged from the road, a long black coat lined in wolf fur, an iron circlet so plain it might have been a cooper's barrel band, and a face no minstrel would have chosen, all heavy brow and a nose set crooked by some old break, and lines cut deep by weather and command. He filled the gate without trying to. The air changed when he stepped through it. She felt it on her skin before her mind named it. A pressure, a heaviness, the way the air goes thick before a storm breaks. And behind her the whole pack came to its feet in a single ripple and went silent, and even the men at the gate dropped their eyes and bent their heads without being told. He was the apex of this world. Everything in the yard organized itself around him the moment he entered it, the way iron filings turn to a lodestone. He had come to dismiss her. She saw that too. She had been looked at by powerful men her whole life, and she knew the look that came before a sentence, the flat administrative weighing of a problem to be removed, and Kyle wore it as he stepped into the yard. A cursed girl, a fouled enclosure, a steward's mess to be tidied. His mouth was already moving toward the word that would end her. Then Ash left her side. The gray wolf crossed the ice between her and the king's hand dropped to the hilt at his belt, because a war beast moving on a man moves to kill, and every soul in the yard drew breath to watch the king cut it down. Ash did not lunge. He walked to within a stride of the Lycan king of Orhold, the most feared being for 300 miles, and he lowered his great head, and he lay down in the frozen mud at the king's feet with his torn ear toward the man, and his eyes turned back, all the way back, to the girl against the wall. One by one the rest of the pack followed. 24 werewolves, bred to take no hand but their keepers, lay down in the ice between their king and the woman his steward had thrown to them, and turned their faces to her. The yard went so quiet she could hear the wind in the high stones. Cale stood among the lowered bodies of his own pack, with his hand frozen on his hilt, and his eyes on her, and whatever word he had brought to end her did not come. What came instead was nothing, for a long moment. He simply looked at her, and she made herself look back, upright against the wall with the cold in her bones and the burn scar hidden in her sleeve, chin level, giving nothing, because giving nothing was the only armor she had ever been allowed to keep. And in that, looking something crossed his face that she could not read and did not trust, a flicker, gone as fast as it came. That was not the face of a king solving a problem. Then he turned and found Bram in the crowd at the gate, and the temperature of the yard dropped a second time. "Who ordered the pack put to her?" the king said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The question moved through the yard like the crack of river ice. Bram came forward with his explanation already running, the safety of the yard, the moving of the beasts, the unfortunate misunderstanding, and the king let him talk himself empty and then said only, "The wolves do not lie." He said it looking at Ash lying in the mud. Then he told 2 of his own road guard to take Wren to the Houndmaster's loft and see her warmed and fed, and he told Bram that they would speak of the running of the lower yards before the week was out, and he turned his horse and was gone into the keep before the steward had finished arranging his face. Wren was carried out of the enclosure on her own feet, refusing the guard's arms, and the last thing she saw as the gate closed behind her was the king standing alone in the yard with the pack rising around him, and not one of them coming to his hand. They put her by Otho's fire, and the old man, surfacing from his fever long enough to understand, gripped her wrist with his hot, dry hand and laughed until the laugh turned to coughing. 11 years, he wheezed. 11 years I told you, girl, and you would not hear it. She did not ask what he had told her. She was busy with the willow bark and the steam, because Otho mattered to her in a way she did not examine, and the wolves mattered, and the work mattered, and the king did not. The king could not. The king was a passing weather she had survived, and would go on beneath as she had survived all the rest. She was very good at telling herself things. She had needed to be. The keep did not let her forget him. By midday, the corridors were full of the story, and it had already begun to change in the mouths that carried it. The cursed girl had become the girl the king had spared. The girl the wolves loved had become the witch who had charmed the beasts to make a fool of the steward. Lady Sable heard it before the bells of noon. Sable was the daughter of the keep's high marshal, raised to expect she would be Vorhold's queen, and she had spent the 3 years of the king's absence arranging the court around that expectation, and she did not intend to lose her throne to a rumor that smelled of the kennels. She came down to the lower yards herself, in a gown the dark green of winter pine, 2 of her women behind her, and found Wren at the trough breaking the noon ice, and looked at her the way a woman looks at a stain on a thing she means to own. "They say the beasts knelt to you," Sable said. Her voice carried. She meant it to. "They say a great deal in a keep with nothing to do but talk. The wolves know their keeper, that is all. You will not keep this one's eye with a stable trick. Go back to your straw." It was the second time the word had been spoken over Wren in 2 days, the lowness of her named out loud in a public place, and she felt it land where such words always landed, in the old burned place under her sleeve, and she said nothing, because there was nothing safe to say. She broke the ice. She fed the pack. She did not let Sable see her hands shake, and they did not, because she had spent 11 years teaching them not to. The wolves saw Sable, though. They came to the trough, and they ate, and the whole time the largest of them kept their bodies between the lady and their keeper, and when Sable stepped too near, Ash lowered his head and showed her, without sound, the length of his teeth. And Sable went white and went away. And that night the story in the corridors gained a new line, that even the beasts knew the difference between a born lady and a true one. Wren heard it and wished it unsaid. A story like that was a knife pointed at her, and she knew who would be made to bleed when it fell. Cale did not come to the yards for 3 days. She told herself she was glad of it, and could not make the telling stick, which troubled her more than his absence would have, because in 11 years no man's coming or going had ever moved her at all. She listened for a heavier step on the stones, and was angry at her own ear for listening, and ground her herbs harder and slept worse, and told herself it was Otho's fever keeping her up. On the 3rd night the king came to the loft. He came alone, without guard, ducking under the low lintel into the firelight while Wren was changing the cloth on Otho's brow, and the old man slept and did not wake. And the wolves in the yard below went silent the way they did only for him. She rose. She did not bow. She had never learned the trick of it, and she did not learn it now. He looked at her across the small warm room, and at the sleeping old man, and at the row of ground herbs on the board, and he asked her what she was giving him. She told him, willow for the heat, mullein and thyme in the steam for the chest, and a little of the poppy at night so the coughing would let him rest. She spoke plainly, the way she spoke of work, and watched him listen as though it mattered. This king, this weather, listening to a kennel girl name herbs over a dying servant, and the not understanding of it made her wary. Men did not listen to her. Men gave her orders or gave her away. He asked where she had learned it, and she said her mother, and he asked where her mother was, and she said dead, and the word came out flat and final the way she had trained it to, and something in his face moved again, that same flicker she could not read, and he looked at her for a moment too long. Then a log settled in the fire, and the spell of it broke, and he straightened under the low beams and said he would send his own physician's stores down for the old man, whatever she needed. She had only to ask the guard at the loft stair. And then he was gone, back down into the dark and the silent pack, and Wren stood by the fire with her heart going in a way she did not have a name for and did not want one. She knelt to bank the fire and her sleeve fell back, and the burn scar caught the light, the pale rope of it from wrist to elbow, and she pulled the cloth over it fast out of an old reflex, and only then realized he had already gone, that there was no one to hide it from. She knelt a while with her hand over the scar and thought about the way he had asked. Not as a king interrogating, but as a man who wanted to know. She told herself it meant nothing. She was very good at telling herself things, and that night, for the first time in 11 years, the telling did not entirely work, and she lay awake in the straw, with Ash's warm weight against her back, listening to the wind in the high stones and feeling, in spite of everything she knew, the dangerous beginning of hope. What she did not know was that the king had walked down from the loft and stood among his pack in the dark a long time, and that for the first time since he was a boy, the wolves had not come to his hand, and he had not minded, because he understood at last why. The old blood ran true in his line. His grandmother had told him as a child that the war pack did not choose by rank or by strength, but by something older, that once in a long age the beasts would find the one their blood remembered, and would not be moved from her, and that the king who was wise would not fight the choosing but kneel to it. He had thought it a story to frighten boys into kindness. He stood in the frozen yard with 24 of his own werewolves turning their faces toward a loft where a scarred girl slept in the straw, and knew it for truth, and knew what it meant, and knew what the court would do to her if he named it before he could protect her. So he said nothing. He went up to his cold rooms and did not sleep either, and the two of them lay awake under the same roof on either side of a hierarchy, with a great deal of blood invested in keeping them apart. The hierarchy moved first, as it always does. Bram was not a clever man but a frightened one, and frightened men are dangerous in the way of cornered things. He understood now that the king's interest in the kennel girl was not the passing interest of a man tidying a yard. He had seen Kale go to the loft alone at night. He had heard the corridors. He understood that if the king's eye truly fell on Wren, the running of the lower yards would be looked at closely, and the cruelties and the missing grain and the coin gone sideways for 20 years would all come into the light at once, and a steward could lose more than his post for that. He needed the girl gone, and gone in a way that could not be laid at his door, and he needed it before the king made her untouchable. So he went to Lady Sable, because they wanted the same thing for different reasons, and frightened greed and threatened pride make a strong rope twisted together. They found their lever in the old law. Forehold, like every packhold, kept the right of the silver trial, a thing out of the deep past, half justice and half superstition. The accused was bound with silver at the wrists, for silver was the one metal the old blood could not heal around, and led into the enclosure with the pack. If the beasts were truly hers by nature, they would not harm her, and if she had charmed them, the silver would break the charm and the truth would show in blood. No one had called the silver trial in living memory. It was a relic, a line in the old books. Still, it was law, and law never struck from the books could be called by any three of the keep's officers together, and Bram was an officer, and Sable's father the High Marshal another, and the third was bought with Bram's silence about a matter of his own. They drew up the accusation that night. The cursed girl had bewitched the king's war pack, and through them sought to bewitch the king himself. And the silver trial would prove it, and the law did not require the king's leave to call it, only his presence as witness. Wren learned of it the way she learned most things, from the corridors, carried by a kitchen girl named Pell, the nearest thing she had to a friend in the keep, a thin, frightened child who slipped down to sit with the wolf pups, and whom Wren had taught to do it without fear. Pell came white-faced through the snow at dusk, with the news that the marshal's men were drawing up papers with Wren's name on them and the word silver in the same line, and Wren felt the cold settle into her in a way the enclosure's cold never had. She knew what silver did. She had seen a wolf cut on a silver blade in a hunt gone wrong, and watched the wound stay open for a month while every other gash closed in days. She did not know fully what she was. She had never let herself ask, but she knew enough to know that silver at her wrists in that yard was not a trial. It was an execution dressed as one, and the dressing was the cruelty of it, because it would make her own death look like proof of her guilt. She did not run. She thought about it. In the long, cold dark of that night, with Pell asleep against her side, and the pack restless in the yard, sensing her fear and pacing with it. She thought about taking the child and slipping out the postern and walking into the white forest and the clean, simple death of the cold, which would at least be hers. Yet Otho was in the loft, mending now. Mending because the king's own stores had come down as promised, and the willow and the king's physician's tinctures together had finally broken the fever, and Otho could not be moved, and would not last a week without her. And Pell would be left to Bram. And the pack would stand at the gate and refuse their meat and grieve until they sickened, because she had let herself be chosen after all. Somewhere in 11 years she had let it happen, and a thing that is chosen cannot simply walk into the snow and leave the choosing behind. So she stayed. She banked the fire and dressed Otho's chest and fed the pack from her own hand and waited for the law to come for her, and she did the one thing she had taught herself never to do, which was to let herself want to be saved. They came for her at the gray hour before the second dawn, Bram with the marshal's men, the silver manacles carried on a cloth by a boy who would not look at her, the accusation read out in the cold by a clerk whose breath smoked over the words. She did not fight them. She held out her wrists, and the burn scar showed when her sleeve fell back, and the clerk faltered at the sight of it and went on. The silver closed over her wrists, and the pain was immediate and wrong, a deep cold burning that ran up her arms into her chest and made the world go thin and white at its edges, a pain that did not lessen the way honest pain lessens but only sat and gnawed, because the silver was not merely hurting her, it was holding something in her shut. Some door she had never known was there, pressed closed by the cold metal, until she could feel the shape of what lay behind it only by the size of the thing now denied. They led her down to the enclosure where the whole court had been summoned to witness, and the king was made to stand at the gate by his own law, and the pack was loosed into the yard, and the silver was meant to break the charm and let the beasts do what beasts do to a fraud. The pack came around her. Around, not at, the wide circle with their flanks in and their heads facing out, the wall of themselves they had made the first night, and they made it again now with their keeper bleeding silver at the center of it, and a sound went through the watching court, because this was not what the trial was supposed to prove. Bram's face came apart. He had not believed it. He had told himself the first night was a fluke, a charm, a thing the silver would undo, and the silver had undone nothing. The beasts knew her with silver on her wrists as surely as without it, and the whole edifice of the accusation crumbled in the space of a breath. He did the only thing left to a cornered man. He seized a spear from the nearest guard, and he drove it not at Wren, whom the pack guarded, but at Ash, the gray wolf at the front of the circle, meaning to break the wall by killing the one who had begun it, to scatter the pack into the blood madness that Silver and a dying packmate would surely bring, and let the chaos finish the girl in a way no law could be blamed for. The spear took Ash high in the shoulder, and the gray wolf screamed, a sound Wren had never heard him make, and the silver in the spearhead. Because Bram had thought of everything, the silver held the wound open and the blood came black across the ice. And Wren, who had held still through every cruelty of her life, who had taught her hands not to shake and her face to give nothing, came up off the frozen mud with her silver-bound wrists and threw herself across the body of the wolf who had chosen her on her first day, and pressed her bleeding hands to the wound to close it, and felt the door the silver had been holding shut blow open all at once. It came out of her as light. She felt it leave the old burned place under the scar first, a heat that was not pain, running down her bound arms and out through her palms into the torn shoulder of the wolf. And the black blood slowed and the wound drew closed under her hands, the silver in it pushed out and ringing on the ice, and the light did not stop there. It ran out from her into the whole circle of the pack, and up the black walls and across the frozen yard, gold and then white, the color of the candle flame and then the color of nothing at all. And the court fell back before it with their arms across their faces, and the silver manacles on her wrists cracked and fell away in two pieces, and Wren knelt in the center of a ring of werewolves in a wash of her own light, with her hand on a healed wolf, and understood, finally, all at once, the size of what the village had tried to burn out of her with a poker when she was 12. She was not a girl without a wolf. She was the thing the Warpack's blood had been wading through the long age to find. The old line the Lycan kings had risen from, that the hierarchy had hunted to its roots and thought it had ended, had not ended. It had been sleeping in the straw of the kennels for 11 years, breaking ice on troughs, grinding willow bark, making itself small. The yard was silent when the light went out of it. Wren knelt in the wreck of her chains with Ash whole and standing over her, and the pack around her and the whole court of Vorhold on its knees, not in homage, not yet, but simply driven down by the force of what had passed through the yard, the way weaker wolves go to their bellies before a stronger. And into that silence the king moved. Cale crossed the ice through his lowered pack, and did not stop at the edge of the circle the way every other living thing in that yard had learned to. The wolves parted for him. He came to where she knelt and he went down onto one knee in the frozen mud in front of her, the Lycan king of Vorhold, the apex of the world, on his knee before a scarred Omega in the same yard where his steward had thrown her to die, and he took her torn and silver-burned hands in his scarred ones, as though they were the only things of worth in the keep. "I knew you the moment the pack did," he said. His voice was low and meant only for her, and the whole silent yard heard it anyway. "I have hunted a war and 3 winters trying not to come home to an empty keep, and the first thing in it worth the journey was a girl my own steward had thrown to my wolves." He did not let go of her hands. "I will not lose you to a law written by frightened men." The words were few and they were total, and he did not elaborate them, and they landed in the cold and the silence and stayed there. And Wren, who had taught herself for 11 years to expect nothing and want nothing and be ready always to be given away, felt the whole architecture of that teaching crack and fall like the silver from her wrists. Then he rose, still holding one of her hands, and turned to the court, and the mercy went out of his face. Bram had not knelt. He had backed to the gate with the bloodied spear still in his hands and a wildness in his eyes, and Cale looked at him across the yard and named what he had done. The trial called without leave, the spear driven at the king's own pack, the years of the lower yards run like a private purse. All of it, in the flat voice that did not need raising. The High Marshal was already trying to put distance between himself and the steward he had backed, and Lady Sable had gone the color of the snow and was looking at the kneeling court as though seeing for the first time exactly how alone she now stood. Bram understood that there was no telling left that would save him. So he did the last thing, what cornered things do. And he threw the spear, not at the king, who would have taken it and lived, but at Wren. He never reached the throw's end. Ash was already in the air. The gray wolf he had tried to kill took him at the throat and bore him back against the black wall, and it was over between one breath and the next, a hard and definite end, the just weight of his own treachery come back on him, and the spear fell ringing to the ice a long way short of where Ren stood. The pack did not touch the body further. They did not need to. They came back to their circle around her and lay down. And this time the kneeling of the court was homage, head after head going down across the yard, the marshal and then his men, and then the lesser officers and last and slowest Lady Sable, who knelt because there was nothing left in the world for her to do but kneel in the same yard before the same assembly, where 2 days before she had told a kennel girl to go back to her straw. What came after came quickly, the way the end of a long cold does. The deeper rot behind Bram, the marshal's part in the bought third officer, the years of skimmed grain, all of it came into the light in the days that followed and was cut out clean. The marshal stripped and sent east to the wall, Sable given to a lesser holding, far from the keep, where her pride could find nothing to feed on. Otho rose from his fever to see it, leaning on Ren's arm at the edge of the great hall, and he laughed his rattling laugh and said, 11 years, girl. And this time she let herself hear it. Pell was given a place in the kitchens that no steward would ever again think to threaten, and Ren, who had walked through the gate of Vorhold at 12 with a basket of her mother's herbs and a face that gave nothing, stood at the head of the same hall in the deep of that winter, while the court that had named her cursed and broken and unworthy now named her by the title the old blood gave her, and the king set no crown on her, because the pack had crowned her already, and a king who was wise did not argue with the choosing. She did not move to the high rooms, not at first. She would not leave the pack, and the pack would not leave the lower yards. And so the king came down, and it surprised the court more than the light had. The lichen king of Vorhold took his meat in the kennels of an evening with a healed grey wolf at his knee, and a scarred woman beside him, whose hands he held without minding who watched, and the war pack that had taken no hand but their keeper's, learned at last to take his, because she was at the center of the circle now and he had been let inside it. On the first night of the spring thaw, when the snow finally let go of the battlements and the river broke loud in the dark, Ren stood in the open door of the houndmaster's loft, with Otho mending behind her, and Pell asleep by the fire, and Kale's hand warm at the small of her back, and looked out over the yard where 24 wolves lay in the running snowmelt with their faces turned up to her, and their eyes catching the first gold of a thaw-season moon. The burn scar on her arm had faded in the days since the light, gone pale to almost nothing, the old brand of the night they had tried to drive the wrongness out of her, healing now that there was no longer any need to hide what it had been meant to hide. Ash crossed the wet yard and climbed the loft stair and lay down across her feet, the way he had on her first day, 11 years and a whole life ago, and put his torn ear against her ankle, and breathed her in, and was still.